All right, what is going on, everybody? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I'm joined today by Scott, our head of product here at SaberSim. But more importantly for this video today, our resident NHL DFS expert. Scott, how you doing?
It's the most wonderful time of the year. I'm great. Awesome. I'm really awesome. I was talking to my wife yesterday, and for some reason, I don't know if it's because I'm on the team this year or what. I am more excited for this NHL season than I can even remember in past years. And you know me, I get pretty excited for NHL. I'm like super excited this year, not just like for DFS, but just like for NHL season to be here. So yeah, I'm doing really well. Yeah, I got the Whalers jersey out and ready to go. So we're rocking and rolling here in Minnesota.
Awesome. Well, we are, of course, talking about NHL DFS strategy here in this video. Goal of this video really to lay down some fundamentals of NHL strategy. I think this is always a fun one for us to do every year because we've got a lot of folks checking NHL out in this little window of time here that are often not only new to NHL DFS, but sometimes hockey in general, right? Like we have a lot of people that come in as football and NBA grinders and want to try out a little puck, and we get an opportunity to talk about that here. So that's what we're going to be doing today, talking about some basics, walking through a build, getting into some more advanced stuff of some ways to add value there. I do want to call out, Scott and I now have done this. I think this is our third time. I think this is our third year of doing this video. The old ones are great. There's still a lot of awesome information in there. We're going to rehash some of that here today to just bring it up to date in 2023. But if you watch this video and feel like you didn't get enough hockey strategy, you can check out those videos from last year and the year prior. So, Scott, anything you want to mention here before we jump in?
No, I think we're going to cover it all as we talk here. But no, I'm excited. Let's do it.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, so do you want to kind of just start by talking about like what a good NHL DFS lineup looks like in general, and maybe in particular, like what does upside look like on the ice? What are we trying to do with our lineup overall?
Sure. So you'll hear people talk about correlation a lot in relationship to NHL, right? And you've probably heard it for NFL, for MLB. So if you're using SaberSim, you probably already have at least an idea of what correlation means, but it really manifests itself very differently in NHL because you've got these like different pockets of players on every single team who are really strongly correlated to one another. You've got a great example right here, Jordan, actually. Austin Matthews is kind of like the quarterback of his line, if you're trying to use it like an NFL reference, where he's got these really strong correlations to Mitchell Marner and William Nylander because they skate on the ice so often with one another. And he is very weakly correlated to other members of the team because they just don't get nearly as much ice time together. You will get like 2 or 3 of these pockets of players on every single team. So it's almost like you've got like 2 or 3 sub teams within every team. So a good NHL lineup takes advantage of these and has these groups of players together in them, not just players from the same team, but making sure you've got players who are likely to be on the ice together at the same time, because it's not the same as like an MLB lineup where the number 1 hitter and the number 8 hitter, even though they don't bat next to one another, still have like a relatively decent level of correlation, compared to the other players on the team. Austin Matthews has virtually no correlation to a line 3 skater that doesn't skate on the power play line, right? So having him, and I'm trying to think of who was on the 3rd line for Toronto this year, and I'm blanking at the moment, but having one of those guys on a lineup with him, like there's nothing inherently wrong with it from a projection standpoint, but you're not really taking any advantage of correlation or the kind of the variance in the sport that's going to get Austin Matthews a 30-point game, and by proxy, Mitchell Marner and William Nylander will likely get 15 or 20-point games to go along with it because they've gotten the assists on the goals that Austin Matthews has scored. So that's a really long-winded way of saying it's taking advantage of these pockets of players on every team. So you've got as much, inter-team correlation as possible within those lineups.
Yeah, and I like the way you put that with almost thinking about this as sub-teams on the teams. And we've talked about in the past sometimes how, line 1 for a given team might be very chalky, and a way to actually get leverage in that spot is to play, the second line for the exact same team, who you'll get a lot different of an ownership situation there. And they really are almost totally 2 different groups there.
Yep. Exactly.
So you mentioned, the skaters here. How do goalies end up fitting into this correlation? We see a little bit of a light correlation here to the same team goalie. I know we've talked about this before, but how do you tend to think about the way that your goalie ends up interacting with the lineup?
So I think what you'll find if you just build straight SaberSim, no rules, nothing in place, whatever, you will get a decent amount of goalies stacked with some skater or skaters on your team because of what you just showed, right? The goalie does have correlation. It's a weaker correlation, but correlation nonetheless to a lot of their skaters. You probably, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll find where's Olmark? And he's in there somewhere, I'm sure. I hope Olmark is in there somewhere. He should be.
We can go back to the other one too here.
Yeah, I don't know where Olmark was there, but so you see Sam's like 0.08. Like obviously there's correlation there. Actually, if you click on one of the goalies, that would be really good to see the goalie correlation. So there's Olmark. Perfect. So you see here, for Olmark in particular, the correlations are pretty weak basically across the board. And in fact, in some cases, he's negatively correlated to the players on his team. I don't know what the actual implied score for the game is tonight. I think the Bruins are projected to win. Yeah, they are projected to win. But I think what you're seeing there is that Olmark's performance is really heavily correlated towards those like shutout lower goal kind of situations. But what you'll see oftentimes is defensemen pretty strongly, relatively speaking, more strongly correlated to their goalies. And some of it just has to do with the way these game scripts are going to play out too, right? But I think ultimately what you'll find is there's no reason to force a goalie into a lineup with a team. You think you're chasing the win or something like that. But in this case, you got a Chicago team that is on a second night of a back-to-back, is probably on tired legs already, and unlikely to get a ton of shots, and that's probably why you're seeing relatively low across the board here. The Bruins are likely to score a lot of points, and it's going to be independent of Olmark's performance is essentially what you're seeing here with this correlation. On other games, you may see it much closer, where you'll see a defenseman with like a 0.1 correlation to his goalie. Our Sims and the builder will take advantage of this and try to stack those players together when it's appropriate. But I think the kind of point that you were getting at was, do you actually build for like goalie level correlation with the skaters? And I don't think you need to force it. The builder will do it when it makes the most sense. So Georgiev is a great example here, where you see with some of the higher tier players here, when McKinnon has his ceiling game, that's probably a hat trick for McKinnon, right? So if McKinnon's scoring 3 goals himself, the Avalanche are probably going to win, and therefore Georgiev is a good play there. But you see, it's a kind of a light correlation across the board rather than a heavy correlation like you see with the lines, because goalie performance is kind of independent to how the skaters are performing. If that makes sense. Independent's the wrong word, but hopefully that makes sense. Kind of, they're not quite as connected because the goalie's not scoring any goals. He's not getting any assists, generally speaking. Someone out there in the chat is going to yell at me for saying goalies don't get assists because they do. But they are kind of independent and more related to how their defense plays and how the kind of the efficiency of the team in front of them is, rather than any skater performance.
Well, and one thing that's always been interesting to me with goalie strategy in general is they need to have a lot of shots on them to actually hit their upside outcome. So you end up in a situation where you want, the goalie maybe seeing 30, 40 shots and then racking up a ton of saves there. So the possession time for the opposing team ends up being pretty important. I mean, one question I have for you is in terms of the way that these game scripts actually play out, do teams, if they get behind early, do they kind of go into that catch-up mode and try to play a little bit more aggressively and put more shots on goal? And I'm trying to imagine a situation where you have a positive correlation because on same team skaters and same team goalie, because let's say McKinnon scores 2 goals early, the Avs are up early, and then suddenly LA just starts playing a lot faster and playing more aggressively. Does that kind of thing play out, or am I just making stuff up here?
I mean, you're kind of making stuff up in
Okay.
like overall for the game itself. I think in the last 5 minutes or so, if a team is
Yeah.
behind, you'll see them really start to pour it on. Then they'll pull their goalie. What's more common is the team that goes up big starts to turtle a little bit.
Yeah.
They'll hold the puck more, prevent the other team from taking shots. So it's less that the trailing team is trying to speed up. It's that the leading team is trying to slow down. And there's less of this now than there used to be. This used to be like a really common thing. I
Mhm.
think teams know that's you're basically playing not to lose at that point rather than playing to win. But I think that's more likely most of the time. I think occasionally what you might see is if a team that's behind gets on the power play, maybe they're a bit more aggressive. Maybe their defensemen play up a little bit further and potentially give up some easy turnovers, something like that.
Mhm.
But in the first period, if the Avs go up 2-0, I don't think you're going to see a huge difference in how the game is played until you start to get later on into the game.
And how did defensemen fit into this here? As we were looking at these top two, Matthews and Pasternak here,
Mm-hmm.
Matthews does not really have a strong correlation to any of his defensemen here. Pasternak does with McAvoy here.
Mm-hmm.
How do defensemen end up kind of fitting into the lineup construction?
So in a couple of different ways. I think the specific issue you called out here is McAvoy is definitely a power play producer, whereas I think Riley was the one that Matthews was correlated with, is more of like a quarterback on the power play. He's not going to produce a lot of points. The points are going to come from those top guys. So the correlation strength there, I think, was relative to McAvoy's point generation abilities on the power play. And I think that's where the defense correlation, especially for these top guys, really comes into play. The ones that skate on the power play lines with the top scorers, and most of that's because you can't guarantee that the best defensemen are going to be on the ice with the top scorers in even strength. Because if you know anything about hockey, there's 4 even strength lines, generally speaking, and 3 defense pairings. Sometimes people make the assumption that even strength 1 and defense 1 are always skating together, right? But that's really not true. The defensive pairings will get 20 to 25 minutes of ice time each, during a game. Mm-hmm. The even line pairings may only get 15 minutes of ice time each. So there's a lot of cross-pollination there. So it's a lot harder to guarantee that, say, Makar here is going to be on the ice with McKinnon in even strength opportunities. But Makar and McKinnon are such prolific power play producers that they have incredibly strong correlation to one another, because that's where they're going to make all their money, so to speak, is going to be on that power play. So I think that's what you're seeing, and that's where that defense correlation really comes into play, is when you're talking about guys that skate on the power play. That's, again, it's a good way to get like low-level correlation to stack a defenseman with a skater just generally. Mm-hmm. But if you want strong correlation, it's really on the power play. Even strength correlation for defensemen is not something you should go out of your way to chase.
Are you opinionated on whether power play or even strength stacking is more valuable otherwise, just for maybe the front 3?
I've thought about this a lot and actually spent a lot of time on this last year also. And I think the field generally still undervalues even strength more than it should, particularly second and third line even strength. Mm-hmm. But power play opportunity is so great that it's really hard to get away from it when you're building too. So I think there are really 2 viable strategies here. And I think either one is okay. One is where you really hone in on high upside second and third lines. I think good examples are kind of what you talked about before, Jordan, right? Like the second line from Toronto. So if you build with Tavares, you build around Tavares in the second line rather than the Toronto power play line, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. I think Boston's second line is tough because it's not very good. But you could do it with Boston's second line. Like all of Boston's points are going to come from their first line and their power play. Yeah, not literally all. Nobody tweet me about that. Yeah. But I think that's the kind of thing you can do to kind of get some edge on the field if you're really looking for edge. I still personally lean more towards using power play combinations, and that's more because I just don't do a lot of adjustments in the builder and in my final lineups to kind of get them out. But I do think that playing for that even strength correlation is probably a way you can get some edge that the field is kind of missing out on sometimes.
And I know one of the model updates we made for this year was basically exactly in line with that. It turned down over the process of refining the sim itself. It brought some of the power play upside and correlations down in favor of a little bit more even strength scoring and upside potential there.
Yeah, I think to not to get too deep into the weeds, I think we were probably over estimating time on ice for power play units and underestimating it for even strength lines.
Yeah.
So we brought that back into a bit more alignment, and also just improved the opportunity and usage for even strength players. Like, you're still going to see really strong correlations and really strong projections for players that skate 1-1. Like, that's still where the money is being made, but it's not going to be totally at the expense of even strength anymore. So a guy that skates EV1 power play 2 should be a bit more viable this year, and it's something we're going to keep tuning as well, right? To as it's a new model, right? We've had 1 day and 3 games of real live NHL so far to test on it. So I think this is something that we can continue to look at as the season goes on as well, to really try and get this better. But I do think there's some improvements that have been made there to how we model the time on ice for both groups.
And last thing I wanted to ask about before we start getting our hands dirty here is ownership. We talk about NBA. A lot of times I almost just recommend people ignore ownership, not truly, but the chalk is just so reliably going to get there most of the time that it's more of a data point to be useful to you rather than a driving factor. Whereas in baseball, almost the opposite story, especially for hitters. You could almost justify just fading the top stack in baseball most slates and end up playing profitably. Where does hockey fall on that spectrum here? How reliable is the chalk? How likely are you to make decisions on who you're playing or fading purely based on ownership there?
I mean, I think the chalk is probably relatively. I mean, compared to, like, let's use MLB as the example.
Yeah.
The chalk is maybe as or slightly less reliable than MLB, which is to say not very reliable, generally speaking. However, I will also say with NHL specifically, you have so many viable players per team and per slate that I think you need to play ownership games less with NHL than you do with other sports. Like, every single team has literally 20 skaters per game that is going to be on the ice at some point, right? And really, I like to say that there's roughly 15 to 17 that are viable players on any given slate for most teams. That is more players per team that's viable than any other sport on the classic slate, right? And the reason I bring this up is there are just so many viable combinations of players that even include the chalk. I don't think you need to go too far out of your way unless you're like specifically like fading an entire team with like a good intention in mind, right? Let's say, look, I think that we'll use Toronto as the example tonight because they're the team with the highest implied goals total. Like, let's say you've got a really good reason to believe that there's no way in heck that Toronto hits this 4.2 goals, implied goals tonight. Like, Austin Matthews is going to fall on his face coming out the tunnel, and they're not going to do anything. Like, I'm not telling you don't make those stands if you have a good reason to make those stands, but I also don't think there's a good reason to just start like tweaking dials after the fact just because, like, oh, I want like 5% more or less ownership of this guy because I'm overexposed to him. I think if the builder and your metrics or the contest sims are telling you to play a specific play, there's a really good reason for it. And there are so many viable combinations that you don't need to go crazy with ownership games with NHL too much. But know that the chalk is more likely to fail than succeed because of the nature of NHL.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think last time we did this video, we didn't have the adjusted ownership column here at our disposal.
Yeah, I don't think we did.
Pretty neat here to look at the discrepancies here, especially for the highest owned skaters in particular in the player pool tonight. You can see that adjusted ownership for some of these guys here is quite a bit higher than that SaberSim ownership indicating that for those that aren't familiar with adjusted ownership, it's basically SaberSim is indicating that these players, their ownership almost counts for more in your lineup because they're not reaching the upside often enough in the sims to deserve their current ownership, which ultimately comes up in SaberScore, which we'll talk about here shortly. I did want to ask, yeah, go ahead.
On that point, can you just open up Klingberg's distribution graph?
Yeah.
I think that's actually what you were saying is a really interesting point. So if you look at it, I mean, look at where his plurality of outcomes are for the slate. A quarter of the time, he's like at 0 to 2 points, or like whatever that 2, 3, somewhere in that range, right? Like that is a quarter of the time. This 45% projected owned player does literally nothing for your lineups.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what adjusted ownership is telling you, right? Like that there's a ton of risk in this. I mean, there's so few times where it actually gets to the upside that you probably need to justify that ownership. I mean, look at that. Like that's an insane tail on Klingberg. So that's really like, if you can look at that to see where the adjusted ownership is actually coming from for a guy like that, it's because of what we were just looking at.
And there's interesting, going one step further here, you can kind of see why other players that's not necessarily uniform across the entire player pool. Like a guy like Austin Matthews here is still going to have downside relative to his average projection, but we're approaching what looks like a little bit more of a normal distribution here. Obviously not, but it's a little bit more normal looking here. And we have an adjusted ownership much closer to his expected ownership here.
Exactly. Austin Matthews is like, he's a pretty good guarantee to get you his 5 shots in the bonus every game, right? Like if he doesn't do that, then things have gone really badly for Toronto. So I mean, that's why like he's a player like that, Matthews, McKinnon, McDavid, like they're safe bets to at least get their opportunities, which is going to make their adjusted ownership much closer, generally speaking, to their projected ownership.
We've kind of been dancing around this idea here in what has become a long intro, I guess, to this video, but I'm curious from your perspective, what is the value of a play-by-play sim when you're building your hockey lineups?
Oh, that is a great question. So, hockey isn't the kind of sport where projection actually matters all that much, right? Mm-hmm. Like these values, like sure, they matter to tell you who is most likely to have a good game tonight, but what really matters is the events that feed the final score of the game, and then ultimately your DFS lineups, right? And every scoring event in hockey has the opportunity to affect 4 total players, right? There's the guy that scores the goal, potentially 2 players that get an assist on the goal, and the opposing goalie, who, unless it's an empty net goal, will lose points because of that goal that was scored. We'll use the goal as the example. The play-by-play sim allows us to know not only is Austin Matthews likely to score a goal tonight or whatever it says, but that when he scores a goal, it's assisted by Mitchell Marner and Morgan Riley, right?
Right.
That is an incredibly important piece of information for then building out the correlations that we were talking about before, right? None of these events in hockey happen in a vacuum. Sure, a blocked shot, I guess, happens in a vacuum because no one else gets credit for a blocked shot except for the defenseman. But it really helps us hone in on both the upside for all these players and the correlation that truly exists between them, not just, these guys skate on the same line, so they're correlated to one another. We actually are able to model, these are the guys most likely to take the shots, and you can't score goals unless you take shots. Wayne Gretzky said something like that, right? You miss every shot that you don't take, I think is what he said. And then it also helps us model, who is most likely to dish off the goal that Austin Matthews scored? And I think with that information, you can build much better lineups that take advantage of how these games are most likely to play out.
Well, and the correlations are pretty diverse here, as we were just talking about, right? Like, I mean, we're looking at some lines, some teams where the defenseman plays on the power play and is very strongly correlated to those skaters, and others where it's not the case. And we saw different goalie correlations. I think trying to manage all of that with rules, which is presumably all you have available to you without a sim, would probably make my head explode trying to think through all of that.
That's the main issue that I have with using lineup rules. And people are going to like this. So Scott says, don't use lineup rules. That's not what I'm saying. But my main issue with using lineup rules is that they are so rigid and they are slate independent, right? Like they don't really take the context of the slate into account when you're building the rule. If you just have a blanket, like stack 4 from whatever, for every slate that you play, that doesn't consider the slate context, that doesn't consider salaries, that doesn't consider what power play lines are most effective. You're just saying do this and everything else be damned. I think the more nuanced approach to, tweak the correlation slider, right? Or to do your adjustments post build, I think is a better way to approach this, because the builder can then take the full context of the slate into account when it's building your lineups and do like what we were just talking about, actually focus on the play-by-play of the sims rather than some artificial limit that you've put on it.
All right. Let's build some lineups, or let's actually get started with kind of a process here. When does the process start? Slate locks at 5 o'clock my time here, 7 o'clock Eastern here. When is it safe to build? What information would we want to have before we started building anything?
I think most days it's safe to build as early as you're ready to start building. Like I probably would have built already today if I had time this morning. I just didn't have time yet, so I haven't. A lot of these teams will have either done a practice yesterday or a morning skate, or in the case of the Blackhawks, they played last night, so we know what their lines were last night. So unless there's like some indication in the app that someone's a game time decision or potentially out that you might need to keep an eye on, you can build really anytime up through now. I will say that teams that do morning skates, which is like a morning practice for those of you who are not familiar with NHL, not every team does them and they don't do them all the time, but they will do them by about now. I think the latest ones are around like 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock Eastern time for like West Coast games. Something like that around that time. So if you really want to wait till like 12 or 1, you're good, because there might be updated lines that come out of that practice. But really by now, you should be safe to at least do an initial build, because at this point, it's unlikely that new news will come out until 30 minutes or so before lock. So if you don't do it now, you're then waiting till 30 minutes before, and there may not be anything worth adjusting for 30 minutes before lock if everything comes in the way we expect it to come in right now. So hopefully that answers the question. NHL news is a little weird, and I think that's an important thing we need to discuss here, in that we're kind of reliant on beat reporters tweeting things out most of the time, and either us or some site picking up on what the beat reporter tweeted out. We're better position now this year to adjust for like problems in our lines than we've ever been before. I don't know if we were going to talk about this later, so I apologize if I'm jumping the gun here. But we actually have a tool now that will allow us to much faster adjust to like issues in our lines in the sim. So you don't have to like make crazy rules to get, let's say, for example, that we learned that Zach Hyman's actually skating on the first line. You don't have to wait, 4 hours for our data source to update. We can update that now and get a new sim out, within minutes when we find that information out. So that's going to help a lot with this. I think it's going to be a lot faster, and the data should be more accurate earlier in the day as well than it has been in the past. So that's a very long-winded way of saying you could build now if you wanted to. It's late enough that you could do that.
And always a good idea. I mean, to check back in prior to lock to make sure nothing's changed. But yeah.
The biggest news will come out in about 30 to 25 minutes before a game locks. If there's like a game time decision or a goalie you're waiting on, or potential shuffle of lines, if it hasn't come out early in the day, it will be for the Montreal game. It would be about 4:30 your time, Jordan, would be when like any additional news might come out for that game.
I know in years past we had talked a little bit about some player pool curation up front, mostly related to lines. Fourth line. Is that something that you're still doing?
I think so. I didn't do it last night because it was a 3-game slate, a small slate. So I left it all alone. But I think all research, all work I did last year told me that there's no reason to leave fourth line skaters in your pool unless they are guaranteed to be on the first power play unit. That's the only time I would leave a fourth line skater in my pool. There's not, I think if you leave them, it's fine. There's like a lot that it's value players, right? They're all, generally speaking, really cheap and filler, but there's just so little upside in these players that it just doesn't make a lot of sense to leave them. So it looks like tonight we don't even have any 4-1s at all on the slate. I don't think a 4-2 is worth, unless we think that's wrong. And oh, there you go. Corey Perry is a 1. Okay. Oh, there's a bug here that we have to fix. It's in staging. It'll go live soon. Where the AG grid filters here will not update properly. You can use a regular filter next to the download button, or just have the number offset by 1, and it should work. But that will be fixed in the next release. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. But yeah, I think fourth line skaters I don't see a great reason to leave them in your lineups. Just because, again, there's just not a ton of upside there, and you just don't need to be that different on anything like a 5 or 6 game slate like we've got tonight.
And the reason for that is almost just like a time on ice kind of thing. They're just not going to be out there often enough to have it come together.
It's time on ice, and also those lines generally aren't out there to take shots. They're out there to bully the other team a little bit. They're out there to give the other lines a break. So they're also just not getting the opportunity when they're on the ice all that often. If like a fourth line guy gets a goal, that he may get you 10 points on the night, but that may literally be all he gets, and that's still not going to be enough to win you most contests if you get 10 points from that spot. It might be, but there's just not enough opportunity there.
You mentioned some slate size thoughts here. Where's kind of that break point where you would start to incorporate those players in?
I think 4 games or more is kind of where my head's at right now. I think so. 2 or 3 game slates, I include them. Excuse me. Yeah. 4 game slates or more, I exclude them. Again, that's not a hard and fast rule, and I think that could always change with more information. But I think that's kind of where I'm at right now, where I think there's enough value on the smallest slates to keep them in, because it allows you to do things you couldn't otherwise do with a $2,500 center or something like that. Mm-hmm. But on the larger slates, it's just not necessary, I don't think.
Anything else on the player pool side here that is part of your process?
Player pool wise, no. Although I will address the elephant in the room about defenseman that comes up every year, because I need to come on to your show, Jordan, and make a bit of an apology to some of the folks out there that have been restricting defensemen from flex over the years. Maybe this is just a last year thing, but defenseman performance was down enough last year that actually I saw enough analysis that defenseman in flex was a bad play last year on the aggregate. So I've been wrong. Well, I was wrong last year anyway. I think it still remains to be seen if last year's scoring environment that was, more heavily weighted towards forwards and, defensemen. Yeah. There's still some Makar for the Avalanche. There's no reason not to include him in your flex, right? Or we'll use Victor Hedman from the Lightning. Probably no reason to exclude him. But generally speaking, it may actually not be the worst thing to exclude any defensemen that don't skate on the first power play line from your flex, from your utility, excuse me. So I'm going to wait for all the comments in Discord to come in about how wrong I was and for all the victory laps around me, because, I think I was wrong last year anyway.
I feel like I'm getting punked or something right now.
No,
that is not what I expected you to say.
Jordan, I am not one who will continue to use bad process if it's bad process. And I saw a lot of really compelling evidence that it was just straight up a bad play to include lower end defensemen in flex last year.
Well, I will say the silver lining here is that the new filters on columns and just some of the new tools that we have at our disposal to curate these kinds of things makes this so much easier than it ever was to do this. I do quickly just want to call out, because I did these things kind of quickly here on the screen, but while you were talking here. So when we removed the fourth line players, what we did is we just set a player filter here. And I actually didn't even know this was here, but we can just say show EV line is not 4 to quickly remove the fourth line players here. And then in the utility column, we can sort by defenseman here. view all the defensemen and just uncheck them all and then quickly add back in the one skating on the first power play line, which is what you had recommended here.
Yeah. I personally will probably still use defenseman and flex because I'm stubborn.
Yeah.
But it may be a bad play is what I'm saying.
Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about the lineup rules here. I know we've gone back and forth on a handful of different rules throughout the years here. I think we did a couple videos and had a few different rules we were playing with last year. Where are you at with this now? Are we doing anything here?
I personally have zero rules set. I want to address that particular one with the skaters against opposing goalies, though, because I think that's an important one to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't begrudge anyone for checking that box when they run their builds. I think that's totally fine and valid. Personally, I find that correlation takes care of that well enough for me that the chances of me getting a goalie against opposing skaters are pretty low. And even when I get it, there's a good reason. I mean, you said it yourself, Jordan, that a goalie oftentimes requires the other team to take a lot of shots in order to succeed. So if I've got a one-off player who takes 8 shots against a goalie that gets a shutout, that's a pretty good combination of players that no one else is going to have. The builder is almost certainly not going to give that to you except on the smallest of slates. But I'm okay leaving that in there just in case that happens. I don't think there's any reason to artificially reduce it because the builder is almost never going to give it to you on a large slate like this.
Yeah, I think I would be interested to see if we get any on this slate. The correlations are so negative there that even just any non-zero correlation, I think it's going to be pretty unlikely here. Yeah. But another thing that, definitely slate dependent there, and best practice is to just leave it unchecked so you open that door in the right slate for it. So,
and any other rules that I've run in the past, Jordan, I think I want to give this new season some time to cook a little bit with some of the adjustments we made to our model before I start adding artificial rules on top of that. So I'm going to give the season, a few weeks to a month to cook before I even start to consider adding in any potential rules that I might need. And, my gut reaction is I may not need any this year with some of the improvements we made and could still make. But, I think that's an open action item still. But for me, I'm not going with any rules whatsoever.
Cool. Well, let's start building some lineups here. Is there anything else that you typically want to take a look at here? One thing that does jump out to me, a lower min salary than we see in other sports. Are you generally pretty comfortable leaving some salary on the table here?
Yeah, I usually use 0, but that's just me for like every sport. I use 0. Yesterday, you'll use yesterday's 3-game slate as an example. If ever there was going to be a time where a lot of salary would be left on the table, it would be like a 3-game or slate or a 2-game slate, right? But yesterday, with the builds I ran and then contest sims on top of that, all of the top ROI lineups were using a decent chunk of salary. So I wasn't getting a ton of like really low, like obscenely low salary lineups rising to the top of the pool. So it was working the way I expected, where it wasn't restricting them from my pool, but the ones I ended up playing still used, most of my salary when I submitted them. So I think I think you could go higher, you can go lower. I don't think there's I don't know what the sweet spot is, but I just don't like to put any salary restrictions on the builder. I would say I wouldn't go any higher than like a 48.5 min, something like that is probably the highest minimum I would go. But again, I think it's personal preference at that point.
And I think for me, the less normally distributed the players are in the sport, the more willing you should be to leave some salary on the table or just have that lower min salary. Because salaries at the end of the day, the way I think about them are basically the site's projection for that player. And those are only as good as average projections themselves are, which aren't very good in sports where players don't have normal distributions and their most common outcomes are not close to their average projection. So seems like a good sport here to be at least comfortable with leaving some salary open.
Your first lineup here, Jordan, is beautiful. It's perfectly correlated. It's a 4-3. Like everyone is correlated to someone else in the lineup. Like this is a beautiful lineup that you got number one in your list here, Jordan. Just play that in all your contests.
Yeah, it might just be the winner.
Look at that. Look at that. It's perfect. I love when a plan comes together.
And I know the models team did do some work here just to improve the sim quality. And I think the lineups that come straight out of the builder this year are going to be a little bit better as a result of that here. So let's quickly touch on the contest sim here.
Sure.
I think that's worth doing here. It's the right part of the process. Computer is slowing down a little on me. We'll get the contest sims open up. I am just going to lock and load one here,
sure.
Using 100,000 otherwise default settings using the SaberSim ownership build here.
Sure.
And we will build this. If you are encountering our contest sims for the very first time on this video, we have a much deeper tutorial that walks into what's going on here behind the scenes and how to use this. In the simplest terms, what is happening is we've just generated 5,000 lineups using the play-by-play sims for each game on the slate, basically taking a given way that the slate could play out and building the best possible GPP lineup for that slate outcome. The contest sim is going to take each lineup in the build here and simulate it in a DFS contest and see how does that lineup perform over 100,000 simulations of a contest and what lineups perform the best over time. That's the quick and dirty here. We'll run it and take a look. But I'm curious, Scott, your thoughts on contest sims in NHL so far, your assessment of this here.
I'm really interested to see kind of what this particular sim spits out for tonight's slate because I haven't looked at tonight's slate at all in terms of sims yet. But here's what I'll say. We're still scratching the surface on contest sims with NHL. Like last night was the first live slate we had with contest sims active and ready to go. So I think all of this is still subject to change a little bit in my mental model. But I loved what I saw last night because the lineups that rose to the top were well correlated, for the most part. It did what you kind of expected, where it brought up high upside, but probably slightly less owned teams to kind of the top of the chart, but was still they were still really strong lineups, right? And I really liked what I saw. And I think that's the real benefit of a contest sim in a sport like NHL, right? It's going to sim that contest all those times. It's going to grab that range of outcomes throughout all those sims and combine that with the ownership leverage that your lineups may have to smartly take advantage of ownership inefficiency rather than just kind of use a blanket approach to fading a certain team or boosting a certain team. And I saw that yesterday running the sims for the 3-gamer, and kind of what I'm seeing here at just a glance from yours is very similar. Like maybe you don't like the naked 5 stacks. I don't have a problem with them personally, but I can see where someone might have a problem with some of those. But I'm seeing a lot of really high upside, strongly correlated lineups here. I don't hate what I'm seeing here at the top of the list for this kind of generic contest sim that you created. Like it looks like you've got the entire Avs power play one line.
Yeah.
Which is that's probably an interesting way to approach it because that's not going to be common, I wouldn't think, to get the whole line. So this is an interesting lineup that you've got here as the number one. But again, I think there's a lot of real opportunity here in a DFS sport like NHL that is probably less sophisticated than the others still to really take advantage of the field with our contest sims. And really getting strong lineups out of them.
Well, and it's a good opportunity also to mention, what we always recommend people do when they are building your lineups, and this is for any sport on SaberSim, is to follow our build, review, revise process, right? So we're at review at this point. We've kind of done what I think is the basic steps to get a functional build. We ran the contest sim, and now we're reviewing the lineups. If you disagree with what you are getting out of here, and maybe you don't want to play these 5 stacks or something like that, or your expectation is perfect 4-3 stacks in 100% of your lineups, that would be then the opportunity to go in and set the lineup rule, run the build again, and run another contest sim, which is perfectly fine. Yep. What I'm seeing here right out of the gate, which I think is kind of interesting, as you mentioned, that the contest sim is not afraid to play some chalky constructions here, or some chalky players, we're seeing more unique constructions here. Like the 5-2s and the 5 starting to pop up a little bit more here.
Love it.
A unique construction to play a team that might be chalky on their own, but played in a way that's kind of a little bit more unique here.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like maybe if you have a very specific idea of what NHL DFS should look like, at the 4-3 is a great example, Jordan, like you mentioned before. Maybe this doesn't pass your eye test, but it definitely passes mine as far as the kinds of lineups I would feel very comfortable playing in a GPP.
What is your eye test? Are there particular constructions that on, let's say a typical slate, a typical medium to large slate, that you're not comfortable playing based on what stacks they have, or are there is there additional player pool things that you check on here after the build is run, or thresholds that need to be met for projected score or anything like that?
For me, it's about the stack exposure first and foremost. I don't really like anything under like a naked 3 stack. So we don't have any of those. It doesn't look like in our lineups, and very few of them in the pool. But basically everything here that you see from 3 down, I'm really not fond of any of those. Even like the 4x2 or the 2x4, excuse me, even though that is strongly correlated. And that's a parlay at that point, basically. I'm not really trying to play parlays right now. You know what I mean? And most of that is just because everything above the naked 3 is taking really strong advantage of correlation of 2 or 3 teams, and almost always at least one of the power play or even strength lines from that team when you've got stacks that large. But I think from naked 3 below, there's just not enough upside in the correlation. Like, will those win from time to time? Will somebody play their cash lineup and win a GPP? Sure. We see it in baseball all the time. We see it in other sports all the time. But I just don't think there's enough correlation or kind of variance-based upside in those lower stacks that I would not include those in my build. So that's like eye test number 1 for me. I think eye test number 2 is, as I'm looking at the lineups, like not all 5 stacks are created equal, right? A 5 stack of players that are like 2 from one line, 2 from another, and a naked 4th line player is not really a 5 stack, which, as a spoiler alert, we are going to try to do some things to make it a little bit easier to tell, like if you've got correlated lines, not just like team stacks. So stay tuned for that. But I would kind of do, again, using the eye test a little bit and going through, like, how strongly correlated are these lines to one another? So this is a really good example here. This 6 stack you've got, this really looks to me like a 5 stack and then a 1-off to me is what this is really, right? It's the 5 like main players from Colorado plus Ross Colton as kind of the 6, which, like, that's fine. There's nothing that says that Ross Colton isn't the right cheap 6th player to use versus, I don't know, Taylor Hall from Chicago or something like that, right? But just, you have to look at it in that way, that Ross Colton isn't really part of your main stack here. If you had like if you had like 3 players in this lineup like that were all uncorrelated but from the same team, that would be a red flag. So like, that's where you can add value by excluding or doing things that remove those kinds of lineups from your pool.
Yeah, and I mean, again, at first glance, they look pretty good. I'm not seeing too many situations where that is coming up here. Overall, I mean, things look pretty good. I am interested. We're actually over the field on Klingberg here, who I guess in the contest sim kind of just looks like a bit of a free square when you're looking at like point per dollar value here.
That projection for that salary is really high. I do wonder if, as the day goes on and kind of our sources start to coalesce, if that comes down a little bit. Maybe not. I could be wrong. But that's what I would maybe keep an eye on throughout the day to see, like, if that changes dramatically, maybe, rebuild at that point.
Yeah.
If you see that value come down. I'm not saying it's wrong because he's skating on power play 1 with Austin Matthews and Mitchell Marner and all that. Like, there's definite upside there. But it is one that I would say, maybe just come back and check it out a little bit later.
When we had talked last year, one of the things that you mentioned was keeping an eye out for significant point per dollar outliers in your pool and maybe even making some projection adjustments. Is that something that you're still looking to do this year, or would this kind of player potentially qualify if it doesn't come down?
I think he would qualify if it doesn't come down. I think that's something I would still be likely to do, just to, kind of impact the final construction of my lineups a little bit, just be a little safer.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also, again, trying to be a little cautious with the changes we've made to the model and how we're aggregating other sources, to just, not jump to making changes right away. Right?
Yeah.
Like, to really give the model a chance to breathe. So I probably wouldn't make that adjustment specifically tonight, but a month from now, we're still seeing, outliers like that. Could I see dropping his point total down to 7 or 8? Sure. And I'm not sure what number it would be. I would need to kind of look and see what both of those values look like at 7 and 8. But that would probably be where I would focus, would be to drop something like that. I don't see anyone else in the defensive pool who jumps out at me as someone that we would need to adjust downward. I think everybody else feels fine to me.
Mm-hmm.
He's the only one. When you get to above 3, that's when you should at least use a little bit of judgment, or at least take a closer look at the why.
Maybe we need another one of these here in a few weeks, and can revisit where you're standing after we've had a chance for the season to play out a little bit here.
But yeah, I think there's a good reason if you would want to adjust Klingberg down. I wouldn't begrudge you on that.
One of the things that I really like about the contest sims is you get some nice natural diversification in your build when sorting by ROI, especially compared to SaberScore here. This
is without min uniques.
This is without any min uniques. Yeah.
But that's wild. I mean, that's great. I didn't realize it would be that good without min uniques. That's impressive. I would love. I'm sure at the high level, the 5 and 6 stacks, you're heavy on Colorado. It looked like. Yeah. But the smaller stacks are just all over the place, is what it looks like.
How do you end up applying min uniques to your builds?
So for me, again, this is how I've always used it, both for even before contest sims and now. I will go as high as min uniques will let me go before the metric I'm using to sort gets below a threshold I'm uncomfortable with. With ROI, it's easy. Once it starts going negative, then I won't play those lineups anymore. So I'll go back up 1 min unique. So we'll say, for instance, if 8 min uniques is where ROI starts to go negative, I'd bump it back up to 7. And that's probably where I would play it if my last lineup with 7 min uniques is still positive ROI. Again, whatever the total is. So it looks like 5 might be the one, 5 or 4 might be the one tonight. It was the same way with SaberScore, right? I would keep upping the min uniques until the gap for the bottom SaberScore lineup was just significantly worse than the previous min uniques value, right? So if there's a huge gap between one value and the next, I'd bump it back up 1, basically, with min uniques if I'm using SaberScore. I think if you're using some custom metric or some other metric to store your lineups, that specific guidance may not work for you entirely, but I think that's a good rule of thumb, is to kind of figure out where the threshold you're comfortable playing is and going 1 less, just because this is a risk strategy for me, right? I am trying to spread out my risk as much as possible. Yes, it does mean that my upside, maybe not bank likelihood, but my upside likelihood on any individual slate may be a little bit lower if the teams that would have been at the top would have been higher. But over the course of a season, if I'm following the good bankroll management strategies and the profit plan, it does help even things out, especially in a sport like NHL, which is so highly variant and such a fickle mistress. I think you really need to kind of max out your min uniques as much as you're comfortable doing. That's kind of the strategy I've always followed since min uniques have been a thing.
And this new compact mode, I think, can be really nice for looking at. That's what I pulled up here. So you can kind of set up your build. It's just this button to the left of the sorting method here, and then right click to edit your columns and basically pull up the information that's actually useful for you in the moment. And then you can play with min uniques and in real time see what the bottom of your pool looks like, both in the rank. So we're now, 4 min uniques here. We're at lineup a little over 1,000 out of 4,000 profitable lineups in our pool. And we can see what is the impact of this here as we're increasing this, getting further and further into the pool. I tend to do the same thing. I look for that big break point where rank or the ROI numbers themselves have made a big jump. I think if this were my build, I might settle in at somewhere around 3 min uniques. This is for 150 lineups. So very different if you're just looking at 20 lineups. You'll be able to get a lot more diversity in there. I think this is important for when you're using contest sims, partially because it will make your build a little less fragile to us being wrong on a player's ownership or their projection, right? If if the contest sim is picking up on a really inefficient ownership projection for a particular line, if that line comes in 5% higher owned than we expected, the ROIs would have been very different. And you can still get leverage there, but also prevent a situation where your entire portfolio is much less profitable than you expected because of the discrepancies of projected and actual ownership there.
One other thing I will note about min uniques with NHL, Jordan, is that as you up it, the chance that a stack type that you're not comfortable with sneaking into your lineups may go up. So definitely a good idea to double check your exposures after the fact to make sure, yeah, see here, you've snuck in a couple. That's just the nature of how min uniques are going to work, right? It's going to sneak in some of those lineups. And I think what it's probably telling you right now is it actually can't meet min uniques the way it wants to, excluding that. So you may have to even drop it down one more, maybe.
I actually think what that was telling me is that bug that we have been trying to chase down there, Scott, because it is meeting that exposure here with the desired number of uniques. So maybe something for us to look at offline here. But
yeah, I think what you're seeing here, what I was talking about, though, like some of these stack types that you probably don't want snuck into your build, because again, it needed to do that to meet that min uniques at the highest ROI levels. Right. You should still be able to find enough lineups without, but it's a good rule of thumb to double check that just to be safe.
I do want to quickly take a quick look at SaberScore and see how our lineups would have been rated using SaberScore, which for those that are not familiar, SaberScore was basically developed using the contest sims themselves, generalizing the results of what lineups were most profitable in a contest sim into variables of how much projection, percentile, and adjusted ownership should be weighted for different slate sizes and contest sizes. So I am curious in particular if this changes so this does change. We get much more concentrated on the top plays using SaberScore. I think, to me, what immediately jumps out is this is probably really where you'd want to make sure you're using some min uniques here to diversify. I would feel a little less comfortable with 60% Winnipeg, 60% Boston than having been diversified.
SaberScore, I think for NHL in particular, but I'm sure it's true for other sports also, is going to be much more sensitive to ownership, or I think sensitive is the right word to use there, where it's going to fade ownership a lot stronger than the contest sims would, especially, again, when you take slate context into account, like we were talking about before. There are tons of ways to build EV lineups that don't involve fading Colorado or Toronto entirely, right? Tons of ways to do it. And I think that's what the contest sims were telling you. SaberScore is a bit more blunt in how it does that, and it kind of fades kind of uniformly across your lineup in a less nuanced way.
During the process of kind of fine-tuning your lineups here after you've run the contest sim diversified, is there anything else that you typically look at here or you want to do as kind of a final quality control measure?
I usually just double check to make sure I'm not overweight on a specific goalie, particularly one I wouldn't want to be overweight on. Just because goalies are really random, and I don't think there's any reason to ever lock in or buy a specific goalie. I think 20% is fine. I wouldn't look at this and think that there's anything terribly wrong here with my goalie construction. But if Cam Talbot came in at 70% on a 6-game slate, that would be something that's not good. And I might look into either why is there something in my build that made that happen, or is it just those lineups just for some reason all coming to the top. I'm not saying you're going to see that often, but it's something that I would do just to kind of double check that. And I guess the other thing I would do, or I often do, is look at the highest projected skaters, like the studs, the superstars, and just kind of get a sense on where I'm exposed to them, and make sure if I have exposure, great, leave it alone. If I'm unexposed, figure out why, and if there's something I need to do to fix that. So like Pasternak looks like I got decent exposure to Pasternak. Matthews is at 12%, 11%. That seems fine. McDavid and McKinnon are a little bit under using SaberScore. I think that's partially some of the fade we were talking about before, maybe.
Yeah.
So those are areas where I might be a little concerned that I'm a little too far under the two of them. But, in general, that's kind of what I do. And like, there's nothing here that would cause me to start setting caps, I don't think. But that's where I would check next. Just make sure I'm not going to be like so underweight one of the studs that I know it's going to be a long night before it even starts.
And I think the leverage column could be really useful for this as well.
Sure,
just checking, here's where I'm most over, here's where I'm most under. Does this check out with the way that I wanted to play this slate? And if it doesn't, there's plenty of lineups in the pool generally to make some adjustments and get a little bit more exposure to players you want and less that you don't there. So
exactly.
Let's quickly touch on late swap here. You mentioned 30 minutes or so before games start, get a little bit of that final news. How often do things change in that final 30-minute window? How often are late scratches coming up?
So, if we set aside like someone that we know ahead of time is a game time decision, like that's like a known thing you can plan around.
Yeah.
Scratches are less common than MLB seemed to be the second half of the season, where it seemed like there were 3 or 4 every night with MLB. Less common than that. But I think the one thing you will see, particularly for teams that don't do morning skates or practices that morning, is either mixing up their lines or on their lower lines or defensive lines, bringing in like players from the minors or from the reserve rosters to fill a spot on the team. So that's something that might happen. Is that going to make a huge material impact on your lineups? Probably not, but it's something to keep an eye out for ahead of lock, that like you don't have a value defenseman that's all of a sudden not playing because the coach wanted to give somebody else a game and give that guy a rest, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, scratches come because someone hurt themselves in warm-ups or something like that. Like we usually know otherwise ahead of time that someone is potentially going to be out for a given night, and you can plan around it.
And
Go
ahead. I cut you off.
I was going to say, how that applies to late swap is, I think for me personally, for these like smaller tier things that we were just talking about, I think quick swap is my preferred method, just because it's faster, so I don't have to spend as much time on my computer doing anything. But B, it doesn't really the change, if it's a third line defenseman for a third line defenseman, is kind of, I don't want to say it's a superfluous change, but it doesn't do anything to really change the makeup of the slate, right? There's no critical slate impact. So I don't want to run the risk of doing any changes that will do anything to my initial kind of play, my team pool, my stack pool that I curated carefully just for this one player, right? There's risk involved in me messing something up by doing a late swap. I could mess something up by doing a late swap. So I'll quick swap guys like that. The times I do late swaps for NHL are if a player that eats a lot of salary is ruled out, or was a game time decision is ruled out, that changes the context of that team or the rest of the slate, right? Something that actually does a material impact on how the slate could play out. Something like, we'll use an example because the late game tonight is Winnipeg Calgary. We'll use that game as an example. If Mark Scheifele is ruled out 20 minutes before that game, he eats up 6,100 salary. He's a 1-1. That is something that can have a material impact on that game and the kind of the construction involving those 2 late games on the slate. There are other players and lines I might want to get in there if he's out, right? That's a great late swap opportunity, something like that. And goalies, again, I have the same rule as kind of before. Unless there's just a really terrible goalie who got called up as an emergency, they are basically interchangeable cogs. So I will just do a quick swap one goalie for another if a different goalie is playing than the one we anticipated. The only time that doesn't work is if we projected the goalie who was more expensive, or who was less expensive, and the other one comes in more expensive and you don't have enough salary. So oftentimes worth a look to see who is not confirmed for the night,
Yeah.
and see if you need to reserve a little bit of salary just in case they're not playing. It looks like tonight it's everyone who's the more expensive one is projected, so I think we're okay, but that's not going to be the case all season long. So just worth keeping that in mind.
I am a little surprised that they don't just price them identically across the board.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it is weird. And I think that would make things so much easier. I mean, here's one, Chicago.
But he's confirmed.
He is
confirmed.
Yeah. So,
and because Mrazek started last night, it's almost certainly not. He's almost certainly not playing today.
yeah.
So that's one where there's no risk. It's the one where the guy's not confirmed that there's a bit more risk.
Cool. I have a couple other questions here for you. One thing I wanted to ask is you had mentioned that the profit plan here, a great resource for contest selection overall, but our options are a little bit more limited in the hockey lobby, and these contests look pretty undersized to me. We're going to fill the $4 here pretty quick already before even noon my time. But do you have any other thoughts, like above and beyond the profit plan, of just contests that you like to play or like to target based on the payout structure of those contests, or just who is available, who can play in certain contests? Or, I mean, I think that the profit plan does do a good job of like a nice baseline, but there's just less contests here. There's less ways to enter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be really boring here and say that I try to follow the profit plan as closely as I can. I will say early NHL season, I go above 5% bankroll just because I love DFS hockey.
Yeah.
So that's just me personally taking the extra risk just because I love getting more lineups in. But generally speaking, throughout the season, I'm following the profit plan. So I'll just play everything that they'll let me play up until I hit whatever the bankroll I'm willing to play for that night is. There's, as long as you get in early enough, there's usually enough that you can play that you can get your action in, unless you have just the biggest bankroll and you can't find contests to play. If that's you, I'm sorry, then this advice is not for you. But for the typical user, I think you can always find something to get your 2% or your 3% in.
Yeah.
That fits, that still has a decent ROI chance for you, and let you get your action on NHL. Yeah, it doesn't look as sexy as the other sports by any stretch of the imagination. That's true, but I think there's enough there that you can still get your action in. Like I said, unless you've got just the biggest bankroll.
One thing I will mention that I have just noticed, and I think this is something that is probably worth talking about in a separate video here. One thing I found is that if you run the contest sims using the exact payout structures from different contests, what will often come out of that is that as your contest becomes flatter and less top heavy, the ROI of all of your lineups comes down, which does make sense. The max that a given lineup can earn in a contest has come down there. The effect of that, though, ultimately ends up often being that there are fewer profitable lineups in your pool. The flatter the payout structure is, because lineups that were profitable in a very top-heavy contest because of their off chance of getting first place in that contest and reaping all of that equity, well, now they're only getting 5% of the prizes, and that might not happen often enough for that lineup to be profitable. As a tiebreaker, and again, I think this is something to explore in a bigger video, but as a tiebreaker, if you're entering contests, especially at the lower stakes, I would keep a little bit of an eye out on the payout structure of a contest, preferring slightly to play contests that are actually top heavier, which I think is a little bit counterintuitive. Especially, I have noticed when you start to get to contests that are about 5% or less to first, a surprising amount of the pool sometimes ends up getting knocked out of that contest because the rake is too high and the prize to first isn't high enough that there are absolutely still probably 1,000 plus lineups in your pool that are profitable for that contest, but there are fewer of them. And especially if you're not on the ultimate plan and you don't have the ability to run the contest sims yourself, I think leaning on the side of playing a little bit of a top heavier contest is a better way to go, especially at the low stakes where there's a limit to how top heavy the contests get, period. Like, you're not going to find a 40% to first contest under $3. But if you can play one that's 10% to first instead of 5% to first, I think it's more likely that any given lineup in your pool is profitable there.
Yeah, I think during the NHL season, the mini maxes are at the low stakes end up being like the top heaviest, which sounds terrible because they're not that top heavy.
Yeah.
But it's just all the low stakes stuff is in this kind of dead zone. I think these mini maxes look like they're 10%.
They are
but
10%.
There will often be a closer to 20% mini max as you get further along.
Mm-hmm.
It ends up being like it's like a $2,000 prize pool, but $500 to first, something like that, as the season goes on. So that one is top heavier. I mean, it's a mini max, so if you don't win it, you're kind of screwed. But the problem with like NHL low stakes is kind of the worst of the worst when it comes to those payout structures. Mm-hmm. They really flatten it out a lot, kind of like for the turbo MLB slates too, which were kind of the same way, right? The very flat payout structures at the low end. Right. So it's just hard to find those top heavy ones. I think some of the single entries can get top heavier sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's worth looking at the single entries. The forecheck, the $4 is often top heavier. So I think that's a good one to play if you're trying to decide if your $80 should go there or in a 50-cent mini max.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, it's just tough to find low stakes top heavy contests.
Well, a couple other questions for you, Scott, and then we'll get out of here. The first is somebody playing NHL DFS for the first time this season. One piece of advice you'd give them.
It's going to sound cliche, but trust the Sims, and I mean that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of your own kind of bias about both DFS and the sport that you can incorporate if you don't really know much about NHL DFS. I think just default out of the box, we do a really good job of building you competitive lineups for all these contests that you don't have to do anything extra to do on or to succeed with. Mm-hmm. I think start there and then start adding pieces to your process as you learn more about how the sport works, rather than taking someone who's been playing the game for 6 years as advice and add all these different rules or start adjusting projections and ownerships when you don't really know what you're doing. Yeah. And my advice to everyone has always been, if you don't have a really good reason for what you're doing and can't articulate that reason, don't do it. Mm-hmm. Like that's kind of like always been my advice. And it's the same for people starting NHL. Like start from that baseline of just trust what we do and build on top of that, rather than immediately starting to kind of build your own thing and shoehorn us into that process.
I'm going to put your feet to the fire here a little bit.
Yeah.
For the guy that says, I don't want to just do the push button print money thing. And one way or another, I'm leaving my mark on this build. I want to research something. I want to tweak something. I want to look into something. Where would be the first place that you might send somebody to go add a little bit of value? Maybe it's to projections, ownership. Maybe it's whatever you think. Where would we send that person?
I think the two places we can add the most value, even if you're still new to NHL, are in our field lineups for contest sims. I think there's still some improvement there to model how the field is going to play. I think we're better. We're already better than we've been in the past with our ownership model.
Yeah.
But I think, and this is true of a lot of other sports too, I think we can still be even better there. And I think you can add a lot of like nose to the grindstone value by better understanding how the field is going to play and using those as your field lineups rather than our default SaberSim ownership. Our SaberSim ownership is good. It can be better, and you can be better by doing that. So I think that's number one for kind of the people that are using Sims and want to kind of add value there. I think the other place that you can add value, independent of the Sims by themselves, is kind of what we were talking about before when you're looking at our projections and how they match up to the value that exists within the particular. I think Klingberg was the example that we were using before, right? I think there's very obvious places where you can try to add value up and down when looking at value on the individual players. If you see a guy who's a value of 1, there's probably a question to ask of should he really be that low? And in the Klingberg example, should he really be this high? And I think you can start to do a little bit of digging to see, does this projection look right? or should I make an adjustment here? Go to any of the myriad hockey resources that are out there to kind of look at quality shots that he or the team he plays around are taking. Klingberg is, he's new to Toronto, so it's hard to know exactly how he's going to play with the Toronto system this, turning in a new season.
Yeah.
But I think that's another place you can add value that doesn't involve setting rules or, anything like that. It's just kind of tweaking the dials a little bit to get you something that is a little closer to how the slate actually might play out in your mind.
Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't get to here? We've been cruising for over an hour now. We've been pretty thorough, but anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to make sure we talked about?
There's nothing that I can think. Oh, sorry. I did think of one thing. If you're not playing Showdowns, even though they're very low stakes and the contests aren't great, you should be. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to just kind of like bump up your bankroll just a little bit, especially now that we've got contest sims and again improved ownership as well. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to, again, you're not going to become a millionaire playing NHL Showdowns.
Sure.
But if you're looking for a place to get some of your action in, there are a few contests there you can play, and I think we are better positioned than the field to do well in them. So don't ignore the Showdowns, even though they don't look very sexy.
And I know we had touched on Showdown strategy a little bit last year. Might be another video we can do here, specifically breaking down Showdowns. I can't take up your entire afternoon here. You could. Maybe we'll come back and talk about Showdowns in another video.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. Cool. Well, if you have made it this far in this video, hope you enjoyed it. And if you're not a SaberSim subscriber, we have a free 5-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. You'll get access to NHL. You get to apply all the stuff we talked about here in this video, but you get every other sport as well. You get football, the end of the baseball season here, NBA in 2 weeks, a little less than 2 weeks from right now. So come check us out. Free 5-day trial. You get the contest sims. You'll get the projections, correlations, everything we've talked about here today. One of the things we didn't even get to talk about at all, which maybe this is another thing we could break down here, is the contest flashback. I think it would be really interesting to go in, pull up a contest, and take a look and see what constructions, what kind of ownership context, what was the most profitable way to play given slates, especially with actual ownership in there.
I didn't even look at yesterday. I wonder if I won the ROI game yesterday, because that's all that really matters, Jordan, is that you have the best expected ROI.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have been crushing the expected ROI game at NFL Showdown all year. Very happy to say that's the case, except for the fact that I am very, very unprofitable so far in NFL Showdown this season. So
as long as you can say you're winning the ROI game, that's all that matters. What else matters? There was one other thing we didn't mention. You can now play NHL Owners Box with SaberSim. We didn't even bring that up. And I was just thinking of that as of yesterday. So if you want to get your action in elsewhere, again, we've talked about Owners Box before. It's newer, so it's less full of sharks and pros. There's some NHL contests over there that you can play as well with their unique Superflex construction. So you can play 2 goalies at a time if that's what you've always dreamed of.
Yeah, and I mean, if NFL has been any indication, there generally are some pretty good overlay opportunities there. I would say if you're playing with a smaller bankroll, you might be best getting your money down on Owner's Box first. Take advantage of the reduced rate or the overlay opportunities there before even branching out to other sites here. All right, cool. Well, we will leave it there. Thank you as always, Scott. I am off to go buy my lunch with my expected ROI from my NFL contest this year. We'll see if the restaurant takes sim ROI for payment.
Looks like I was 14th in sim ROI for the forecheck yesterday, so not quite first. Lots of familiar names on that list, though, so SaberSim's doing well in the ROI game.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Again, hopefully this will just be the first of many here of videos this season. I think at least NFL Showdown, maybe a contest flashback video, and maybe we just revisit with Scott here in a few weeks and see how things are looking at the start of the season. But until then, good luck this NHL season, and we'll see you later.
See you guys.